Ooh, we're back. We're back for more Autistic History today in part 2 of the Autism Wars, and that first front that I can find that started back in the 60s and 70s between autism researchers Bruno Bettelheim versus Bernard Rimland and Ivar Lovaas. Those two were teamed together, plus parents. And this is in the 60s and the 70s. And this clash is over the refrigerator mother's theory, which was incredibly harmful, incredibly problematic. It caused great stigma, and Bettelheim's solution was to separate these children from their families because he believed they were psychologically damaged somehow. And the other two researchers were like, absolutely, this is not the case. And the parents were like, absolutely not the case. Understandably, no one wants their kids taken away and being blamed for terrible things. This is just, it's a terrible, terrible, terrible theory. So this is where we're going to start. And while Bernard Rimland was instrumental in helping to break this belief in this terrible theory, that I'm not even sure was a real theory to begin with, but great work with parents and coming together to break this myth and to stop disconnecting families over this and stop blaming parents for something that they had no influence over unless it was genetics. But that's where the positive stuff ends for us here in autistic community, because Bernard Rimland and Ivar Lovaas would go on to push their origin ideas of autism and their solutions for autism, but we will get to that. Let's talk a little bit more about Bruno Bettelheim and his history and his work here in the United States, plus so remember when I say these researchers all shady, and there is some dark history here for all of them. None of these guys are coming out with crowns on looking great, unless maybe it's Ivar Lovaas, who seems to have won these Autism Wars out now in 2023, but I'll explain more of that as we go. Now, before I get too far into the details of Bruno Bettelheim, mind you, this idea and approach was pushed out of the United States during this first Autism Wars, but it was not pushed out of every country in the world. I believe France is still dealing with some of these issues over there, and it's a vastly different landscape for them to navigate. So keep in mind, every country, every place in the world is a bit different, but America here, at least this is one thing we are not fighting against still. So I'm going to share from my notes and research that I've done over the past years at a slow pace. I'm not very fast, but my notes are also available on internationalbadassactivist.org. You can look up Bruno Bettelheim and it'll pull up a timeline and notes page if you are interested in clicking through and all that, finding sources and more information and more details. So in 1903, Bettelheim was born. He was an Austrian-born psychologist, scholar, public intellectual, and writer who spent most of his career here in the United States. Now, Bettelheim was born Jewish, raised secular, and being in Austria, was caught up in that era. You know what was happening then. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say that word on here, but the political annexation of Austria back in 1938 affected Bettelheim. He was arrested about 2 months later and was imprisoned in camps for 10.5 months. So that's a lot to experience. And oh yeah, so anyhow, I'm gonna share that he drew from his experiences at these concentration camps for some of his later work. And in 1939, he arrived in New York and joined with his wife, who had already arrived, and he became a naturalized U.S. citizen in 1944. So he writes schizophrenia as a reaction to extreme situations, and that is published in 1956. Now, keep in mind, schizophrenia and autism are often interchangeably used in this era, or maybe shortly after, but autism was first recognized, I think, in 1911 as a condition or a subcondition of schizophrenia. I'm not sure exactly how that went, but childhood schizophrenia or childhood psychosis would have been a diagnosis that autistic kids would have gotten back then, whereas they would be diagnosed as autistic now in the medical model. So keep that in mind. It comes into play a lot in our history here, this idea. And in 1959, Bettelheim published Joey, a Mechanical Boy. So now we're getting set up here for the 60s. The 60s is when Bernard Rimland and incredibly angry parents, and absolutely, I would be so angry with them as well. This is really, refrigerator mother theory is horrible, and it's just, yeah. So this is when Bettelheim starts to lose some ground here in the 60s, when this uprising parents with Rimland starts in. So let's spill the tea on this theory if you are not aware of it. And mind you, it's very, very harsh. This description by Leo Kanner, and in his 1949 paper, he observed children were exposed from the beginning to parental coldness, obsessiveness, and a mechanical type of attention to material needs only. Quote, they were left neatly in refrigerators which did not defrost. Their withdrawal seems to be an act of turning away from such a situation to seek comfort in solitude. And here's some more. Another slap. Kanner described parents of autistic children in a 1960 interview as just happening to defrost long enough to produce a child. Yeah, right. Bettelheim was able to use the University of Chicago to gain acceptance of this theory by both the public and medical professionals. So he had a lot of influence with the University of Chicago affiliation, and established a level of trust with his work because of that affiliation. And he also illustrated his theories on autism in a 1967 book, Empty Fortress, Infantile Autism and the Birth of the Self. So it says here, Bettelheim compared autism to being a prisoner in a concentration camp. And I'm going to share, it says here, the difference between the plight of prisoners in a concentration camp and the conditions which lead to autism and schizophrenia in children is, of course, that the child has never had a previous chance to develop much of a personality. Right. All right, so that's enough for part 2. Part 3, we're going to look at the conflict between these autism researchers and what they said about one another. And oh boy, it just gets really wow. So more in part 3 of Autistic History, the Autism Wars. We are still in the 60s and the 70s timeline era.